My family's been using Craigslist forever, buying and selling things since I was a kid. It always felt sketchy to me, meeting random people in places I'd never go to otherwise just to save a few bucks. But saving money is saving money, right? A few years ago, we needed a bed frame and had no luck finding one nearby. So, my mom turned to Craigslist. After some browsing, she found a post that seemed promising. The seller's messages were off from the start, too eager, suggesting we come to his house, which was in some tiny out-of-the-way town. My mom felt uneasy about it, and she trusted her gut enough to turn him down. He even tried dropping the price to get her to come, but she refused. A couple of weeks later, we saw on the news that an older couple went missing. They'd been on their way to buy something off Craigslist, just like us. Their bodies were discovered in a lake near the address my mom almost visited. It was a small place in West Virginia, a lot like where that bed frame guy wanted us to go. The same guy was caught and arrested. He was a murderer, preying on people looking for cheap deals. I think about it sometimes. My mom could have been another one of his victims, and I might have been left without a mother because of a stupid Craigslist ad. Since then, I've sworn off buying things from strangers like that. If you really need to, make sure it's somewhere public, with plenty of people around. And always trust that gut feeling. It's probably trying to keep you alive. Last year, I messed up my ankle pretty badly and was stuck in the house for weeks. I live alone in a small bungalow, so when it happened, my family and friends were super helpful. But soon enough, I realized I'd have to figure out how to maintain my yard without bothering them too much. Everyone in my neighborhood really cares about their lawns. Everything's neatly cut, the hedges are sculpted, and almost every yard has flower beds. Mine isn't anything fancy, just some flowers near the porch and mostly grass that I usually mow every weekend. Since I didn't want to hire an expensive lawn service for just a couple of weeks, I decided to look on Craigslist for someone to handle it temporarily. I found this ad from a guy named Tyler. The listing said he'd just finished high school and was looking to do odd jobs before college. Yard work was specifically mentioned, so I figured he'd be perfect for what I needed. I reached out, and Tyler responded quickly. He seemed excited to get started, and we agreed he'd come by once a week to cut the grass, water the plants, pull any weeds, and pick up fallen branches. Shouldn't take him more than an hour or two each time. Tyler showed up the next week, but I was immediately thrown off. He looked way too old to have just graduated. The guy had deep lines around his eyes and a full beard that made him look at least 35. I awkwardly asked him about it, and he chuckled nervously before saying he just looked older than he really was. He admitted that he hadn't updated his ad in a while, claiming he meant to change it a couple of years back. Seemed more like a decade to me. Still, he was already there, so I figured I'd give him a shot. I gave him the rundown of what needed to be done, then went back inside to catch up on some work. I was working part-time from home back then and tried to focus, but I couldn't help sneaking a few glances out the window. Tyler moved slower than I expected, but seemed thorough. After an hour or so, he finished up and I paid him in cash. He gave me a small nod and left without much small talk. The second week was odd. The yard work hadn't changed, but Tyler stayed for nearly 3 hours. I wasn't paying him by the hour, so I couldn't figure out why he was hanging around for so long. He finally wrapped up and left after what felt like forever. The following week was his last, and it got even weirder. He seemed to be taking his time again, and I noticed him lingering around some of the windows and corners of the house. It looked like he was trying to wipe down the windows, but that wasn't part of what I asked him to do. I stayed out of sight, watching him quietly through a crack in the blinds, trying to figure out what he was up to. Eventually, he finished and came to the door for his pay. I handed over the cash, trying to act casual, and then watched as he drove off. I was relieved I didn't have to deal with him anymore. Something about him felt off, and I was tired of the uneasy feeling he gave me. That night, around 1 a.m., I was still up, scrolling through my phone. I've always been a night owl, so staying up late wasn't unusual. But then, I heard it. The soft creak of a window being pushed up somewhere at the back of the house. My stomach dropped. There was no doubt in my mind it was Tyler. It just had to be him. Maybe it was just paranoia, but I was certain. I sat up in bed, listening carefully, and then heard slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the house. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to act. I stepped out into the hallway and shouted as loudly as I could, saying I knew it was him and that I had a gun. Total lie. I didn't own one, but I needed to scare him off. To my shock, I heard the footsteps retreat. There was a scramble of movement, followed by the distinct sound of someone pushing themselves back out the window. I cautiously crept out to the living room, my heart racing. The window was wide open. I rushed over and glanced outside. Just as I thought, there he was, Tyler sprinting across the yard and disappearing down the street. The next morning, I went straight to the police with everything I had. His name, his number, even the messages we'd exchanged. It wasn't hard for them to track him down. His ad was still up on Craigslist. Looking back, I'm thankful I hadn't gone to bed early that night. If I hadn't been awake, I can't even imagine what could have happened. A while back, I was trying to find a place to rent, and I turned to Craigslist. I was crashing at my cousin's house and needed to get my own spot soon. They weren't being pushy, but I could tell they were itching to have their space back. I got the message, and I started checking listings on Craigslist, which is like a digital flea market for anyone who's never used it. The good thing was, I didn't have a lot of stuff to move. My entire life could fit into a truck bed. Just a bed, a dresser, a fish tank, and a couple of bags. So I was on the lookout for a tiny studio. After skimming through some bizarre listings and dodging a few scammers, I found something that seemed too good to be true. A fully furnished studio apartment in a decent part of town. The pictures looked amazing. It had everything I'd ever want, and then some. I called up the owner, and after a short conversation, we set the move-in date for the upcoming Monday, provided I could wire the deposit by Friday. It was Wednesday at the time, so I had just enough time to scrape together the cash and transfer it over. He wanted $500 up front, which was a little over half the monthly rent. The owner reassured me that this would cover the first month. Considering it was the middle of the month, that sounded fair. He even mentioned I wouldn't have to pay again until the first of the next month, which would be $750. Seemed like a solid deal to me. Monday rolled around, and I showed up with my truck loaded up. The owner was already waiting for me outside. We had a quick chat, and he showed me around. The place was better in person than I'd imagined, furnished to the brim. I even asked him why it had so much stuff, like it was someone's lived-in home. He mentioned it used to be an Airbnb, which made sense, and he was just done with the hassle of short-term renters. He wanted someone stable. Sounded perfect. I thanked him and promised I'd have the full rent on the first. I signed the lease he had printed out, and we parted ways. I was excited. But that excitement didn't last. By Wednesday, my third day in, things started going downhill fast. By Wednesday evening, I was lounging on the couch, flipping through channels, when I heard voices coming from the hallway. I didn't think much of it, probably just neighbors passing by. But then I heard a key slide into the lock. My heart jumped. The door creaked open, and a couple walked in. The next few seconds were a mess of confusion and panic. They stared at me like I was some sort of burglar. I was equally stunned, looking at them like they were breaking into my place. For a solid moment, none of us moved. Then, they demanded to know who I was, and I told them I was the new tenant. They shot back that they were the tenants. We all started talking over each other, voices getting louder and more desperate. Turns out, they were the actual tenants. They had just been on vacation for a couple of weeks. I, on the other hand, had unknowingly been renting a unit that was still theirs. After a lot of back and forth, we all laid out our documents. I showed them my flimsy lease agreement, and they pulled out their legit, much more professional-looking lease. I brought up the texts and email exchanges I had with Mario, or whoever that scammer was, along with proof of the $500 deposit I sent. But it didn't matter. They lived there. I didn't. The worst part? They had no clue who this Mario guy was. The name didn't ring any bells. I was crushed. We called the cops to file a report, and they treated the whole thing like some twisted comedy of errors. In the end, I apologized for using their stuff, eating their food, sitting on their couch, and we came to an agreement. I could leave my few belongings there for a couple of days while I moved back to my cousin's place. Mostly it was just my fish tank and dresser, since those were the hardest things to move. Luckily, they were super chill about it. I mean, they had every right to kick me out on the spot, but they didn't. No one got violent or anything. I was grateful for that. Sadly, I never managed to track down the guy who tricked me, and I lost the $500 I'd paid. I did stay in touch with the real tenants for a little while after that, and they told me they had their locks changed right away. No one ever figured out how that guy got a hold of the key to their place. So yeah, that's the story of how I ended up squatting in someone else's apartment. A couple of months later, I did find a legit place through Craigslist, and this time it worked out fine. No unexpected guests or anything. I know this whole situation isn't the kind of horror story that makes your skin crawl, but it's still eerie to think about. That guy had planned it all out, knew they'd be away, and somehow had the keys to get in. It's the kind of thing that makes you double-check your locks before going to bed, just in case. Even though everything got sorted out, it still lingers in the back of my mind as a weird, unsettling reminder that some people can slip right into your life without you even knowing it. They say hindsight's 20/20, right? Looking back now, I see all the red flags I should have caught. It was 2008, and I just hit 25. I finally managed to move into a place of my own. Nothing big, just a small, one-bedroom rental. But I was proud. Fresh out of college with a new job at a small finance firm, I was getting my life together, or so I thought. Money was tight though, so I was living off what I made every 2 weeks. To get some extra cash, I started selling stuff I didn't need on Craigslist, mostly old gadgets and cheap paintings. It worked before, so I figured I'd try again. I posted an ad for an old phone I no longer used, and within hours, I got an email. A guy wanted to buy it and was available to meet that day. I didn't feel good about letting strangers into my place, so I suggested we meet up at a nearby diner. He agreed, and we set a time for the evening. When it was time, I grabbed the phone and charger, jumped in my car, and headed out. The diner was about 20 minutes away. As I pulled into the lot, I noticed it wasn't that crowded, which seemed normal for a weeknight. Nothing odd about that. But now that I think about it, I do remember 2 cars parked side by side, a beat-up blue Honda and a shiny black Jeep. I didn't connect any dots then. I parked close to the door, texted the buyer to let him know I'd arrived, and waited. He replied that he'd be there in 5 minutes. I put on some music and zoned out. Sure enough, a few minutes later, a guy in a hoodie steps out of that black Jeep and heads towards me. The exchange went smoothly. He handed me cash, I gave him the phone, and we both thanked each other before going our separate ways. But as I headed back home, something felt off. I made a few random turns, and that's when I noticed a blue car. One that looked just like the Honda from the diner, sticking close behind me. I still didn't connect it to the diner, thinking it was just a coincidence. The longer it followed me, though, the more uneasy I felt. I was about a block away from home when I glanced back and noticed the car turning onto another street. That made me feel better. I shook off the nerves and made it home without any issues. I stepped inside, locking the door with a shaky hand. I tossed some leftover pizza into the microwave and tried to calm down. Maybe it was all just in my head. After eating, I decided a hot shower might help me relax. The tension started to ease, and I was almost ready to crawl into bed and forget about everything. But then I remembered. I left the curtains in the living room open. I didn't like the thought of anyone being able to peek in, so I went to close them. As I got closer to the window, I noticed something odd at the end of my driveway. My heart jumped into my throat. A car was sitting there, half hidden by the shadows. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and felt a wave of dread. It was that same blue Honda I'd seen earlier. I stood frozen, staring out into the dark. My first instinct was to check the door again, still locked, thank God. I backed away and flipped on the porch light. That's when I saw it more clearly. The car was empty. The driver must have left on foot. I had no clue where they were, but they were close. Too close. Hands trembling, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The operator asked me to stay calm, said officers were on their way. I tried to keep it together, but then I heard it, the sound of footsteps creaking on the porch. My heart hammered as I turned off the lights, hoping they'd think no one was home. It didn't work. The footsteps didn't stop. I dared to peek around the corner, just enough to catch a glimpse. And there he was. A guy standing right against the glass, his face covered. He was staring into the dark living room. He didn't move, just stood there. We locked eyes, and I almost screamed. For a second I couldn't do anything but whisper, "Police are on their way. Get out of here." My voice was shaking, more like a plea than a threat. I knew I didn't sound convincing, but then, like a miracle, I saw blue and red lights flashing down the street. The guy must have seen them too because he jerked back and bolted. Within seconds, the cops were pulling up, tires screeching as they blocked the driveway. The guy and two others I hadn't even seen ran toward their car, but it was too late. The police were already on them, cuffing them one by one. As they led the men away, I realized I knew one of them. It was the guy from earlier, the one with the black Jeep. He didn't say a word, just kept his head down. One of the officers turned to me and said, "This kind of thing happens more often than you'd think." I nodded numbly, but my mind was racing. What if I hadn't closed the curtains? What if I'd ignored that feeling? I used to live in San Antonio, and about 5 years back, I ended up catching the attention of some creepy guy through a job post on Craigslist. I have Asperger's, and at the time, I had just turned 22 and was desperately trying to find work by sharing my resume everywhere I could. I even included a picture of myself, hoping it would make my application stand out a bit more. This was a few months before I landed my first job at a small store, and I was really struggling. One day, I got a call from a man who sounded gentle, almost like someone pretending to be a friendly uncle. But there was this weird undertone to his voice that set me on edge. He said he'd come across my resume and wanted to offer me some work. Said he owned a cafe nearby and was feeling pretty lonely. I assumed maybe he needed help with cleaning tables or running some errands. But things got strange real quick. He mentioned he was gay and asked if I'd be comfortable being his friend. Then he threw out the idea of meeting up. When I asked him about the job he was offering, he went quiet for a second, then said, "Actually, no real work. I'd just pay you to spend time with me." He started asking if I had a girlfriend or any romantic interests, so I told him about my struggles and how I'd been turned down by every girl I ever liked. He listened a little too eagerly, saying he could help me out with that. Then he shifted to talking about how good-looking I was, and that if he were younger, he wouldn't have turned me down like those girls did. At that point, I was beyond uncomfortable, but I stayed on the call a little longer just out of sheer confusion. He went on about how he could show me how to please someone properly and said stuff I'd rather not repeat. I hung up and felt so gross. After that, he started calling me from blocked numbers, his voice getting sharper and more intense, sometimes even angry. He kept saying things like he knew what I looked like and could find me if he really wanted to. Said I wouldn't understand how good another man could make me feel unless it was forced on me. I stopped answering his calls, but about a week later, I got another unknown call around midnight. This time, I didn't even pick up, but it left me restless for days. Getting calls like that in the middle of the night from a complete stranger messed with my head. I wasn't thinking clearly, and only later did it hit me how dangerous the whole thing was. Since then, I've stayed far away from Craigslist and anywhere else I might end up getting contacted by someone like him again. Back when my son was around 6 or so, I was raising him on my own. We didn't have much. I was working part-time and every paycheck barely stretched far enough. Our apartment wasn't in the nicest part of town, but I did my best to keep him safe, fed, and happy. I think I managed okay, given the circumstances. Things are much better now. He's grown up, I've remarried, and life's taken a turn for the better. Still, I can't forget how tough it got sometimes. This story's about a time when something really bad could have happened. I shouldn't have even brought him with me that day, but in a twisted way, I'm relieved I did. Looking back, I realized the real issue wasn't my choices. It was how much I trusted a stranger. It was just after my ex-husband and I separated. I'd lost our house and was trying to start fresh. My son was barely 7 when we settled into our new place. It was a small, cramped unit in an old complex, but it was ours. I was still coming to terms with the divorce, trying to get back on my feet. Working limited hours meant money was tight. I had some support from a family member who helped cover rent. Still, it was rough adjusting from having everything under one roof to juggling bills on my own. I remember feeling pretty good one day when I realized we were settling in, but that's also when I noticed something. I didn't have a vacuum cleaner. It's one of those things you don't think about until you need it, and I quickly found out they cost a lot more than I expected. So, in a moment of desperation, I turned to Craigslist to hunt for a cheap, second-hand vacuum that wouldn't break within a week. I figured if I could find a decent one to last us a year or so, I could probably save up enough for a brand new one later on. I didn't want to go for anything too pricey, so I stuck to browsing the mid to low range. Finally, I found one that seemed good enough, and the seller was only asking for $15. The guy seemed normal enough through our chats. No weird vibes, no red flags. I honestly thought it would be a straightforward exchange. Show up, pay him, grab the vacuum, and leave. But my first mistake was agreeing to meet this guy at his house instead of somewhere public. Back then, I didn't really think it through. I was still new to doing things online, and I naively assumed it would be just a quick 5-minute errand. That following Saturday, I texted him that I was on my way. He confirmed and gave me directions to his place, which was in a neighborhood I didn't know well. When I finally pulled up, there he was, standing on the front porch, casually sipping a can of soda, watching me as I parked. I hesitated for a second, but then I grabbed my keys, and my son, who was about 7 at the time, hopped out of the car and stuck close to me. I thought about telling him to wait inside, but that didn't seem like a great idea in a place I'd never been before. As I approached, the man called out my name, confirming I was who he expected. I nodded, and he turned, holding the door open with one hand and gesturing for us to step inside. He assured me he'd just grabbed the vacuum from a back room. We shuffled just a few feet inside the door, and I stood there, clutching my purse tightly, my son at my side. The guy walked across the living room and disappeared into what I assumed was a bedroom at the end of the hall. From there, he kept up small talk, mentioning he'd just replaced the vacuum belt and apologizing that it was missing one attachment, though it still worked fine. Right after he came out with the vacuum, he asked me out of nowhere if I believed in God. I was caught off guard, but I nodded and said, "Yeah, I do." Then, trying to make sense of why he'd ask that, I followed up, "Why do you ask?" He gave a weird half smile and said, "Just curious. Didn't want to take you away from church just for this sale." He stepped closer, holding the vacuum, and continued, "I'm pretty serious about my faith, so I get how important it is to attend church." He then asked me directly, "Do you and your son go to church?" It felt strange, but I thought maybe he was just trying to make small talk. I explained we hadn't gone recently since we were still new in town and hadn't found a church yet. He nodded, like that made sense to him. And then everything took a turn for the worse. His smile faded a bit, and he said something I'll never forget. "You know, God told me you'd show up alone today. And if you did, I was supposed to take you away, out into the desert." I just stared at him, not fully processing what I'd just heard. Was he joking? But the way he looked at me, dead serious, no hint of humor, made my blood run cold. He must have seen the fear on my face because he chuckled softly and said, "But you didn't come alone, did you? Your son's with you. Guess that's God's way of testing me, making sure I'm truly obedient." I wanted to bolt right then, but I felt frozen. What would he do if I just turned and ran? It was like we were both holding our breath, waiting for the other to make a move. Finally, he sighed, like he'd made up his mind about something, and casually pushed the vacuum towards me. "Here, just take it. I don't need the money anyway," he murmured. My hands were shaking as I grabbed it. I turned around, motioned for my son to follow, and we hurried back to the car. The entire time we walked, I could hear him murmuring some kind of prayer under his breath. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. Definitely not a typical Bible verse. I just kept walking, not daring to look back until we were inside the car with the doors locked. I sped out of there so fast, I'm surprised I didn't get pulled over. Later, as I tried to calm down, my son piped up from the back seat. "That man was weird, wasn't he?" I forced a laugh and nodded. "Yeah, buddy, he sure was. He had no idea how close we came to something much worse. That day changed everything for me. I swore I'd never meet anyone from an online ad at their house again." From then on, every sale was in a busy parking lot or some other public place. I also blocked his number right after I got home. He did try to reach out one last time, asking if I wanted to join him at his church. I simply replied, "No thanks," before cutting off all contact. On the plus side, the vacuum did work, so at least that part wasn't a lie. But it's safe to say I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes when he told me what God had supposedly said to him. A couple of weeks back, I had to fly out to this small town I'd never heard of to check out some places to live. I'm relocating there in the fall for my master's program. My girlfriend came along for support. Before we left, I had gone through tons of apartment listings online and scheduled a few visits. Our first stop was in a more isolated neighborhood, sort of out of the way. The landlord seemed fine in his emails and asked me to call him about an hour before we arrived to confirm. I called, but he didn't pick up. We decided to head over anyway, hoping he'd show up. About 10 minutes before the scheduled time, he finally called back. "Are you still coming?" He sounded like an older guy, and there was something unsettling about how slow he spoke. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured it was a senior thing. "Yeah, we're already outside the place," I told him. "We?" he repeated sharply, like I'd said something wrong. "Oh yeah, my girlfriend's with me." "You didn't mention a girlfriend before. You never said anything about that." His voice dropped, and I could almost feel his tension through the phone. I hadn't thought it was necessary to mention since she wasn't going to be living there. She was just tagging along to help me decide. I quickly explained this, but there was this long, uncomfortable silence before he responded. "It's just, sometimes people don't tell me they're bringing others. It catches me off guard. I'll see you soon." He hung up without another word. I told my girlfriend what he'd said, and she immediately suggested we leave. It was weird, but with so few apartments available, I stubbornly insisted we at least check it out. As we debated, a young guy slipped out of the house we were set to view. He looked rough, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He gave us a single look, then bolted to his car and peeled out of there like he was running from something. "That's unsettling," my girlfriend said, shooting me a worried look. Still, it didn't feel like a good enough reason to just give up and go. We waited a few more minutes before the landlord arrived. He was tall, mid-50s, and built like a lumberjack. His eyes were disturbingly blank, no spark of emotion at all. He approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "Normally, I'd shake hands, but mine are dirty," he said. "From what?" my girlfriend asked, sounding on edge. "Work," he replied curtly, no explanation given. Then he turned his attention entirely to me, ignoring my girlfriend. He asked all sorts of questions: why I was going to grad school, if I'd seen any other apartments, if my girlfriend was going to move here too. The whole time, he stared at me without blinking once. Meanwhile, my girlfriend tried to ask him basic stuff, like how long he'd owned the place, but he wouldn't give her the time of day, acting like she didn't even exist. Then, out of nowhere, the landlord said, "Let me show you the basement." This was the moment we should have just bailed. But I kept telling myself that he was just an odd, overly cautious local, and we were probably overreacting. My girlfriend was way less convinced, practically shooting daggers at me with her eyes. But she didn't want to leave me alone either, so she trailed along as he led us around the back of the house, away from the main street, toward this small standalone shed. He opened the door, revealing a set of stairs that went straight down into pitch-black darkness. He flicked a switch at the top, but no light came on. Any normal person would have been like, "Oh, must be a blown bulb or something." But he just stood there, making this weird humming sound like he wasn't surprised at all. Then, without saying a word, he started descending into the darkness. He stopped halfway down, just standing there in the shadows, and called up to us. "Aren't you coming?" There's no point if there's no light," my girlfriend said, clearly trying to keep her voice steady. For a long minute, he didn't move, didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he turned around and walked back up. He shut the basement door without a word and took us inside the main house. That's when things got even weirder. The front door, the only obvious way out, locked itself as soon as we stepped in. My girlfriend tried fiddling with it a bit, but when the landlord noticed, he got really tense and told her to leave it alone. I caught her sneaking it open a crack when his back was turned, just to make sure we could get out if needed. Inside, he kept steering us into tiny, cramped rooms, and I kept noticing his hands dipping in and out of his pockets. He'd pull them out fast, like he didn't want us to see what he was reaching for. In his ad and over email, he'd said there was another grad student currently renting the place. But as we looked around, it felt off. There were a few stacks of books scattered around, but none were anything a student would be reading, just random, outdated stuff. A bowl of apples sat on the kitchen counter, but the fridge and pantry were completely bare. No plates, no cups. The closet had a couple of t-shirts hanging there, like they were just props. He couldn't even tell us what school the other student supposedly attended or how long they'd been living there. And then there was that one door. It was the only room he hadn't shown us. When I asked about it, he waved it off, saying it was just the attic and there was nothing of interest up there. The reasons he gave were bizarre. It was unfinished, full of junk, and smelled terrible. That last part I believed. Standing near it, I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach churn. Eventually, we made up some excuse to leave. He trailed behind us to the front door, watching us the whole time. As soon as we were out, he got into his car, but I noticed him waiting, eyeing us until he thought we were out of sight. Then he quietly got back out and slipped inside the house again. That night, my girlfriend couldn't stop talking about how off everything felt, so we did some digging on the guy. We found 3 things. 1, he was supposedly a well-respected figure in the town, known by pretty much everyone. 2, there was no record of him owning or managing any rental properties. And 3, his home address was the exact house we'd just been in. Definitely one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. This story came from a friend of mine named Lily. She was scrolling through Craigslist one evening, searching for a used car. As she was browsing, she heard a light rapping on her bedroom window, but she didn't pay it much attention since it was supposed to rain that night. After some searching, she came across a listing for a car she really liked. I can't remember the model, but it was priced at around $200, which seemed like a steal for her. She messaged the seller, showing interest. The next morning, Lily woke up to a response from the seller, who provided his address and suggested she come by to see the car. She quickly replied, "I'm heading over now." Just as she hit send, she heard that faint tapping on her window again. She shrugged it off, chalking it up to a branch swaying in the wind. Lily decided to drive her dad's old truck out to the address, which was about 45 minutes away. She didn't mind, though. She enjoyed taking drives, especially out of the city and into quieter areas. But things started to feel off when she finally arrived. The place looked completely deserted. She pulled into a gravel driveway that led to a shabby, almost collapsing house. A man stepped out from behind the door. He didn't smile but motioned for her to come closer. "Car's in the garage," he said in a flat tone. Lily felt a pang of anxiety. He was standing too close, almost nudging her towards the garage. The voice in her head screamed for her to leave, but she brushed it aside. He pulled out a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. The garage door creaked open slowly, revealing pitch darkness inside. When Lily stepped into the garage, she finally got a good look at the car. She circled around it, inspecting it carefully. To her relief, it looked exactly like it did in the photos. Clean, well-maintained. For a moment, The tension in her chest eased. Maybe this wouldn't be as bad as she thought. But as she made her way around to the back of the car, she noticed something odd. The man had stopped following her around the vehicle and stood near a small workbench behind it. There, spread out across the surface, were dozens of photos. At first, she thought they might be images of the car's different angles, maybe showing damage or repairs. But when she leaned in closer, her stomach dropped. They were pictures of her, sitting by her window, walking outside her house, even sleeping. Her heart pounded as her eyes darted back to the man. He was smiling wider now, almost grinning. "Lily runs perfectly," he said in a tone that made her skin crawl. "I've only had her a few months. A buddy of mine gave me his truck, so I don't need this one anymore." Lily didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her body reacted on its own, turning and sprinting back towards her dad's truck. It hit her then, the tapping sound she'd heard the last couple of nights. Someone must have been outside, snapping photos of her, watching her. She fumbled with the keys, but managed to unlock the truck and slam the door shut. The man had started moving too, but she didn't stick around to see what he would do next. She gunned it out of there, her hands shaking so hard she could barely steer. Her mind raced as she called the police, her voice breaking into sobs. By the time she made it back home, she was a wreck. Tears streaming down her face, gasping for breath. To this day, the part that terrifies her the most isn't what could have happened in that garage. It's the fact that this man somehow knew everything about her. He knew she was looking for a car, knew what she wanted, and crafted the perfect ad just to get her out there. How long had he been watching her, and how close had he really gotten? When I turned 21, I knew it was time to leave my parents' place and find somewhere on my own. It wasn't that I didn't get along with them. I loved them a lot, actually. But the rules were suffocating. They always wanted me home by 9 p.m., while all my friends were out until way later. I'm not saying they were wrong. It was their house, their rules. But I felt boxed in. I needed my own space to just breathe and be me. So I decided to look for an affordable apartment, not too far, maybe 15 minutes from home, to keep them close, but still have my freedom. After about a month of searching, I found a one-bedroom place that seemed perfect. It wasn't fancy, but it was cheap, and with my part-time job, I could make rent. I signed the lease, paid the deposit, and the place was mine. On moving day, my parents helped me pack up my few belongings, mainly clothes, a desk, and a small TV, and move into the new place. It hit me hard then that I had almost nothing to fill up even a tiny apartment. My bedroom was basically empty, except for a bed and a dresser, and my living room had the TV and a lonely chair. While talking about what else I needed, my dad suggested checking Craigslist for some cheap furniture. He offered to split the cost with me if I found stuff that worked, and he'd even drive me there with his truck to pick it all up. I thought it was a great idea. Besides, having him around would make things feel a bit safer when dealing with strangers. Over the next week, I browsed a ton of listings, reaching out to several sellers. Some replies were clearly scams, automated messages that didn't even make sense. A few others wanted to sell but bailed when I told them I couldn't pick it up right away. It was frustrating, but eventually I got in touch with a few people willing to hold on to their stuff until I was ready. Then I stumbled on a listing titled, "Furniture, Clothes, Electronics. Everything must go. $250 for all." The post had a few blurry pictures, a couch, a couple of chairs, and a heap of random items stacked in a corner. It looked like a lot, considering the price. Curious, I reached out, asking if they still had it and if I could take a look sometime that week. The reply I got was weirdly quick. The seller agreed, but there was no name or personal detail, just an address and a time tomorrow at 4 p.m. I almost ignored it, but the deal was too good. I sent the address to my dad, who agreed to go with me the next day. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the place wasn't in the best part of town. The listing had so much stuff: a couch, 2 dressers, a couple of gaming consoles, a solid desktop computer, and a bunch of men's clothes that were pretty much my size. I thought I'd struck gold. Sure, the post looked a bit shady, but if it was legit, I'd be able to deck out my new place and have some gadgets to mess around with, all for $250. I dialed the number in the post, and a woman answered. I mentioned the listing and asked why she was selling everything so cheap, since it seemed way too good to be true. She said her boyfriend had left her about 2 weeks ago and hadn't been back since. All the stuff she wanted to get rid of was his, and she just needed it gone. She even sent me a few pictures of herself in front of the items as we talked, probably to convince me that it wasn't a scam. I offered to pay the full $250 if she could hold it for me until the weekend, since it was already Thursday, and I needed some time to get everything set up. She agreed, saying I was the first person to show serious interest, and promised to mark everything as sold. I couldn't believe my luck. I called my dad, telling him I'd found a crazy deal. He sounded skeptical at first, but I explained that I'd talked to the woman, seen proof, and that all this stuff was from a breakup. After a bit of back and forth, he agreed to come with me on Saturday morning to pick everything up. Saturday rolled around, and I texted her to let her know we were on our way. Her reply was a simple, "Okay." It was short, but at least she acknowledged it. As we drove to the house, I was feeling even more confident. The neighborhood was really nice, which made me feel less worried about the deal. I mean, who just throws away stuff like this in such a well-off area? We pulled up to a 2-story house with a perfectly maintained lawn and freshly painted shutters. It didn't look like the kind of place where people were desperate to get rid of stuff. I rang the doorbell, expecting a quick answer. Nothing. I waited a minute, tried again, still no response. I started to feel that nagging doubt creeping in, so I pulled up our text messages to double-check the address. Yep, we were at the right place. Feeling a bit anxious, I decided to call her. It rang a few times before going straight to voicemail. I tried again, thinking maybe she just missed the call, but it went straight to voicemail again. I turned to my dad, who had his arms crossed, looking more annoyed than worried. He shrugged and suggested we wait a bit longer. Maybe she was in the backyard or something. After a few more minutes of waiting, I knocked on the door, hard enough to be heard throughout the house. Still no answer. My excitement was slowly turning into unease. As soon as I dialed her number, I could hear a faint ringtone coming from just inside the house, almost like the phone was lying right by the door. That's when I caught sight of something strange through the window. My dad shot me a look, scolding me for being nosy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. I mean, this house was pristine, no signs of anything out of the ordinary, and she seemed genuinely eager to get rid of the stuff. But as I stared through the glass, it hit me. There was someone sprawled out on the floor, just inside the entrance. I backed up a bit and mumbled to my dad, I think something's happened to her." He moved over, looked through the window, and then his whole demeanor changed. He didn't even hesitate before telling me to call 911. The way he said it made my heart pound. I fumbled through the call, stammering about how we didn't really know the woman, just that we were here to pick up some items. I remember feeling stupid trying to explain it, like I was trying to convince the dispatcher that we weren't some crazy people showing up out of nowhere. "We're here to buy some stuff from Craigslist," I said. "There's a woman inside, and she's not moving. I think she's unconscious, or worse." The first cop arrived a few minutes later, and we had to go through the whole story again. He took one look inside, and then everything shifted into overdrive. They broke down the door, and next thing I knew, medics were rushing in. Cops were everywhere, and we were stuck out in the driveway like a couple of suspects. They bombarded us with questions: why we were there, how we knew her, if we'd seen anyone else around. I handed over my phone, showing them the messages, the post, anything that proved we were just there to buy some furniture. After what felt like hours, one of the officers came over and told us the woman was dead. And not just dead, murdered. He didn't give details, but the way he said it sent chills through me. We had stumbled onto a crime scene, and I had been texting a woman who was probably already dead or dying on the other end of the line. I felt sick. Thankfully, the texts and screenshots were enough to clear us of any involvement, and they let us go after getting our information. I asked if they thought it was her ex-boyfriend, like she'd mentioned in her messages, but they didn't say much. Just a lot of, "We'll be in touch," and "Thanks for your cooperation." They never did call me back, though. I don't know if they caught the guy or if they're still looking for him. All I know is that the guilt still lingers. What if my message to her set him off? What if my interest in buying his stuff was what pushed him to do it? I try not to think about it too much, but it's hard not to wonder if my involvement, no matter how indirect, might have been the spark that set everything ablaze. I ended up furnishing my place with a few things from other sellers, but I've never gone back to Craigslist. I know this kind of thing isn't typical, but the thought of dealing with someone else's tragedy like that again? No way. I'd rather pay full price at some furniture store than risk being part of something that dark ever again. There's some truly strange people in the world, and they seem to gather on Craigslist. Sure, some folks do legit business there, but it's also a magnet for the weirdos. You'll never know which is which until it's too late. I was in a bind, needing a roommate fast to help cover bills. The apartment building's owner was fine with me taking someone in, but I knew I was rushing it. I had just moved in and was desperate. If I didn't get someone soon, I'd probably end up sleeping in my car, and that was something I wasn't about to do. After a few days, I got a response. The guy's name was Daryl. He came by to check the place out, and everything seemed normal at first. He looked like someone I could even be friends with. Maybe we'd do some late-night gaming sessions or grab some beers. He liked the same stuff I did, so I didn't see why not. I explained the deal, told him we'd split everything 50-50. He handed over the cash right then, which felt like a good sign. The first few weeks were fine. We hung out, played some games late into the night. But as he got more comfortable, things started getting off. There were tiny red flags I didn't pick up on right away. Little stuff, like disappearing for hours at odd times or talking to himself. But it wasn't until he brought a girl home one night that I realized something was really wrong. I'm not a prude or anything. Having someone over isn't an issue. It's just that they were loud. I'll spare you the details, but I didn't get any sleep that night. The next morning, I told him I could hear everything. He shrugged, saying he couldn't help it. Said it was just how he was. I asked him to keep it down when I was around. He nodded like he understood, but I never saw that girl again. After that, new girls started showing up every few days. I wasn't sure where he was finding them, but it didn't feel right. I told Daryl straight up, if this girl was going to be living here too, she'd need to pitch in for rent, or he'd have to cover her share. He nodded like he got it, but nothing ever changed. One morning, I woke up to their shouting. It wasn't your normal argument. It sounded vicious, like they were both at their breaking point. I peeked around the corner, and they were just screaming at each other, their words all jumbled up. I couldn't make sense of it, so I went back to my room and put on my headphones, hoping it would just stop. I left my last place because of this kind of chaos, and here I was, dealing with it all over again. I really hoped this would be a one-time thing. But a few days later, they started up again. This time, Daryl and I were watching some random YouTube videos when she burst in, picking a fight. He jumped right into it, shouting back. I didn't want to get dragged into their mess, so I grabbed my keys and left. By the time I got back a few hours later, they were still at it, just hurling insults at each other. It didn't get better. The arguments became a daily thing. I'd end up staying in my room, pressing my pillow against my ears, but I could still hear them. They were loud enough that I couldn't drown it out anymore, no matter how high I cranked the volume on my music. It felt like I was living in a nightmare. The stress was getting to me, and I couldn't deal with it much longer. I thought about asking the landlord to step in, but he told me it was my problem to solve. He wasn't going to get involved. I felt trapped. Daryl started acting weird with me too. He'd throw random jabs, mocking me for not being man enough to handle the noise or the mess. I started avoiding him altogether, staying in my room as much as I could. Finally, I hit my limit. I couldn't live like this. I packed up what little I had and left. I didn't even tell Daryl I was leaving. I found another place to rent a week later. Cheaper, quieter, and just better. I felt like I got lucky finding it so quickly. I moved in without looking back. That was a few years ago now, and honestly, I prefer living alone. This was the one and only time I messed with buying stuff off Craigslist. It happened around 7 years ago. It was early summer, right after the rain stopped and everything turned green again. I remember heading out to my shed to grab my lawnmower. I had this really old push mower that hadn't been touched in a while. When I tried to get it going, it wouldn't even make a sound. I messed around with it for a bit, but I'm no mechanic. After some frustrating Googling, I realized it was probably done for. The thing was ancient anyway, and I'd had trouble with it before. My yard isn't that big, so I figured I could just grab another push mower, maybe used, to save a few bucks. I hopped on Craigslist and started browsing through local listings. After a while, I found one that seemed like a good deal. $75 for a decent-looking mower. Seemed fair enough, so I reached out. The guy texted back an hour later, saying I could come by and pick it up the next night. He gave me an address and told me to swing by around 9 p.m. That felt a bit late, but I shrugged it off and agreed. The next evening, I got in my beat-up truck and headed over. It was a bit out of the way. Took me almost half an hour to get there. The place looked like any other middle-class neighborhood. Houses lined both sides of the street. I found the house number pretty easily. The garage door was already open, so I parked on the curb and sent him a quick message to let him know I'd arrived. He replied almost instantly, "Great, come right in, the mower's in the garage." I took a deep breath and walked over. The garage was dimly lit, with just a small bulb hanging in the middle. I stepped inside and glanced around. The place was filled with the usual junk you'd find in a garage: tools, boxes, random stuff. But there was no mower in sight. I called out, "Hello? I'm here for the mower." No answer. I looked around some more and noticed something weird. There was the usual door leading to the house, but there was also another door way back in the corner. It was slightly ajar, and there was a piece of cardboard propped against it. On the cardboard, someone had scrawled "lawn mower" in messy handwriting, with an arrow pointing through the door. My gut told me something was off. But I thought, maybe the mower was just stored somewhere else? Against my better judgment, I walked over to the door. I stepped through the doorway and was greeted by shadows and the smell of mildew. The basement stairs dropped straight down into darkness, with just a faint glimmer of light at the bottom. I squinted, noticing another door off to the right, but the arrow was definitely pointing down. Why the hell would anyone keep a lawnmower in the basement? But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me, and I started my way down. Each creak of the wooden steps echoed, but nothing felt right. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself standing in a half-finished basement. The walls were bare cement, and a few exposed light bulbs gave off a weak yellow glow. I did a slow turn, scanning every corner, but there was no mower. Nothing except some old furniture draped in dusty sheets. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a door upstairs gently closing. I froze. It wasn't a loud slam. It was soft, almost cautious, like someone didn't want to be noticed. My heart began to pound. I tilted my head up toward the stairs, but the doorway was empty. Still, I knew someone had shut that door. The uneasy feeling in my stomach grew stronger. I needed to get out of there. I moved up the stairs as fast as I could without making a ton of noise. But just as I was halfway up, I heard something else. A second door closing, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. They weren't coming from the garage door, but from somewhere deeper inside the house. I didn't stop to think. I lunged for the garage door handle and pulled. Locked. I tried again, yanking with more force this time. It didn't budge. Panic set in. With trembling fingers, I reached for the other door leading into the house. To my surprise, it swung open without any resistance. The inside was dim, a narrow hallway stretching out in front of me. I took a few hesitant steps, listening for any sound. That's when I noticed the living room at the end of the hall. There was a large sliding glass door that seemed to be my best shot at escape. I could still hear those footsteps, getting closer now. Without looking back, I rushed over and slid the glass door open. The cool night air hit me like a punch. I slipped outside and shut it behind me, trying to steady my breathing. Through the glass, I saw him, a man in a dark hoodie rounding the corner. I only got a quick glimpse before he turned his head and spotted me. his pace picked up. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I sprinted as fast as I could, tearing through the backyard, jumping over a small fence, and circling back to the front of the house. My car felt a million miles away. I stumbled into my car, heart still racing, and fumbled with the keys before finally jamming them into the ignition. I peeled out of that neighborhood, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror the entire time, half expecting to see that man chasing me down the road. When I got home, I blocked his number and took down his listing on Craigslist. I reported the whole thing to Craigslist support, though I never heard back. After that night, I swore off buying anything used online. A few weeks later, I bought a brand new mower from the store. No sketchy garages, no basements, no strangers with suspiciously locked doors. Maybe things have changed since then. Maybe not. But I know for a fact I'm never going to forget that night. And I'm definitely not going to make the same mistake again. When I opened my eyes, the light outside told me it was already morning, probably around 11 a.m. I realized I'd been knocked out for nearly 16 hours. I'm amazed I didn't slip into a coma. I saw a face through the truck's window, and my heart almost stopped. I thought it was him again, coming back to make sure I didn't talk. But as I focused, I realized it was someone else. Even though I knew it wasn't the same guy, my fear didn't go away. I could hear him faintly through the glass, trying to ask if I was okay. But my throat was so dry, I couldn't even respond. My head was spinning, and everything felt out of place. Then, I noticed flashing lights in the distance. Before I knew it, paramedics were pulling me out of the truck. Turns out, the guy who found me was the same one who'd called the day before. I'd told him my address on the phone because I mistakenly thought he was serious about buying the tractor and had cash on hand. He came by the next day just to take a look, and that's when he saw me slumped in the front seat, barely conscious. Luckily, my truck's windows aren't tinted, or he would have never seen me in there. If not for that mix-up and the fact that he actually showed up, I probably would have died right there, in my own vehicle. The swelling in my leg was from the weird way I fell after being hit. I'd tumbled out of my chair and landed awkwardly, aggravating an old injury. I'm healing now, using a cane as usual, and I finally managed to sell my tractor and get a new one. But that sense of comfort I used to feel at home is gone. The scariest part is, it was all so random. That guy had no clue what I had or didn't have in the house. He wasn't after money or jewelry, nothing like that. He just picked me at random, and to this day, he's still out there. If you're in Oregon and you're selling stuff online, keep an eye out. Someone might reply to your ad, say they have the money, and then show up just to rob you and leave you for dead. Back when I first moved out, I landed a small apartment while working as a cashier at a local store. The pay wasn't great, so I hunted for cheap secondhand items to fill up the place. This meant lots of trips to thrift shops and late-night scrolling on classified ads. I scored a nearly new couch, a set of dishes, and some mismatched blinds. I even got a few old pots and pans. The only thing I still needed was a decent TV. My parents let me take an ancient tube TV they had in their basement, but the screen was all burnt in. It wasn't bad for watching occasionally, but I wanted something that didn't look like it had been used as target practice. So, I went back to Craigslist to see if I could snag a cheap flat screen. Most of the options were overpriced or miles away, but then I found one that looked promising. A 34-inch Samsung, only $50. There were some pictures, and it seemed fine, so I messaged the seller. They explained they were moving to another state and needed to clear out stuff fast. Sounded legit enough, so I set up a time to grab it. I had planned to go the next day after work since I needed to hit up the ATM, but the seller insisted I pick it up that evening. Said they'd be too busy packing up tomorrow. A bit pushy, but whatever. I swung by the bank and pulled out cash, which meant I only had $60 in hand. No big deal though, since it was still a steal for that size of TV. The address they sent me was in a town about 45 minutes away. I wasn't familiar with it at all, so I set up the GPS and started driving. As I got closer, the roads became narrower, lined with dense trees. When I finally pulled up, I realized I'd driven past it twice without noticing. The third time around, I paid closer attention to the house numbers until I found it. No wonder I missed it. The place looked completely deserted. It was sandwiched between a bright yellow house with a well-kept lawn and a smaller run-down building. One window had plywood nailed across it, and the front door was either missing or hanging off its frame. I couldn't tell from where I was sitting. The driveway was empty, and there were no cars parked on the street either. It felt sketchy, but I tried to reason it out. They did say they were moving, right? Maybe this was some property they were trying to clean up and dump before they left town. Or maybe it was a condemned building, and they were squatting in it until they got kicked out. My brain was working overtime trying to make this situation seem less weird, but then I saw movement by the door. A woman stepped out. She looked rough, matted hair tied in a loose bun, wearing a faded, oversized hoodie. She glanced back into the house, then turned and pointed directly at my car. That's when a guy came into view. This dude was massive, at least a foot taller than me and built like a linebacker. He had on a similar beat-up hoodie, but he kept his hood pulled down low, so I couldn't see much of his face. He just stood there for a second, watching me, then started walking down the steps. I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling building up in my chest as he kept getting closer. Then he started picking up his pace, heading straight for me. That's when something clicked in my head, screaming at me to get out of there. I didn't even think. I just slammed the car into drive and sped off. My tires screeched against the pavement, and I didn't stop to look back until I was at the end of the street. Even then, I could see the guy running after my car. I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror the entire way home, making sure no one was behind me. When I got back to my apartment, I couldn't shake that weird feeling, so I pulled up the listing again on my computer. This time, I zoomed in on the images. Right away, something jumped out at me. The ad said the TV was a Samsung, but in the photo, the brand logo had a V on it. So, it wasn't even the same brand they claimed it was. Then I noticed something else. The window next to the TV showed a snow-covered street with houses in the background. But it was May, and there hadn't been snow around for months. Plus, there were no houses across the street from where I'd gone. That spot was surrounded by an apartment building and some small shops, and the house I went to didn't even have a porch like the one in the picture. I realized I'd been too focused on the TV to pay attention to the other details. I had no idea if those pictures were taken at another place, or if they'd just grabbed them from the internet to make the listing look legit. Either way, I felt stupid for nearly falling into what was probably a trap. I flagged the ad as suspicious and tried to forget about it. A week or so later, I found a decent TV at a nearby thrift store and managed to move past the whole thing. It stayed buried in the back of my mind until one night when I saw something on the news that made my blood run cold. The segment was about staying safe when meeting up with people you don't know for online purchases. Then, they brought up a case where a couple had been attacked after responding to a Craigslist ad. They went to buy something and ended up getting held at gunpoint and robbed. To make matters worse, one of the robbers took off with their car, and their baby was still in the back seat. The incident happened in the exact same town I'd gone to for the TV. Hearing that made my stomach drop. I kept thinking about how that could have easily been me. What if I'd gotten out of the car, all eager to check out the TV? I could have been mugged, or worse. The couple got lucky that the thieves abandoned the car once they realized a baby was inside. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it scared the hell out of me. I can't believe they even brought their kid along, let alone left them alone in the car. After that, I swore off shady online deals. These days, I only buy stuff through local groups, and even then, I make sure to bring a friend along. It's just not worth the risk. About 4 years ago, I found myself renting a small room in a shared house that had 3 bedrooms. The walls were almost paper thin, and my room had just one window. The weird thing? This window didn't face outside. It looked straight into the living room. That detail will matter later. There were 3 of us living there at the time. Myself, the master tenant, and another guy who rented the 3rd room. He was a decent guy, pretty friendly. But due to some last-minute visa issues, he had to leave abruptly and head back to Mexico, giving us around 2 weeks to find someone new to take his place. Our only real option at that point was to use Craigslist. Because of my hectic work schedule, I couldn't be involved in the selection process. Eventually, the new roommate moved in. This dude, let's call him John, seemed different. He was tall and broad, and though he wasn't exactly unfriendly, something felt a bit off. He was quiet, kept to himself. Not someone I'd go out of my way to hang with, but it wasn't like I disliked him. About 3 weeks after John moved in, the master tenant went off to Florida for a family emergency, leaving just me and John in the house. The first few days were okay, nothing unusual. But one morning, around 6 a.m., I woke up to the sound of frantic knocking on my door. It was John, looking visibly shaken. He stared right at me and asked, "Are you going to tell me what was happening last night?" I just stood there, confused. The night before, I'd come back late from my shift, maybe 10 p.m., and after a quick shower, I crashed straight into bed. I told him that, and he just kept shaking his head. He said he heard me screaming, saw me talking through that inside window with a man he claimed was our landlord. Thing is, I'd never even seen our landlord in person at that point. He then insisted that he heard people coming in and out of the house all night long. I was dumbfounded and told him that wasn't possible. He stared at me a bit longer, like he was trying to figure something out, and then just walked away without another word. The next day, the same thing happened. He woke me up early again, saying he'd seen me arguing with someone outside the window. This time, he claimed it was my boyfriend. The problem? I didn't have a boyfriend. He even swore that I had a full-blown conversation with the master tenant, who was still in Florida. He started rambling about seeing me outside with cops, asking if I could give him the badge numbers of the officers I supposedly spoke to. According to him, the house had been crawling with police. That's when I lost my cool. I told him straight up that he needed to cut it out, that I hadn't done anything, and I had no clue what he was going on about. He got this strange look on his face and mumbled something like, "Maybe I had a seizure or something while sleeping. Next time, if you notice it, call 911. I just nodded, hoping that would be the end of it. But an hour later, he was knocking again. I opened the door, and he went on to tell me the exact same story, word for word, like a broken record. That's when I had enough. I told him to stop bothering me and that I had to head to work. That whole day, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was seriously wrong with this guy. But I was too exhausted to spend the night elsewhere. I thought I'd be fine if I just locked my door and ignored him. That was a huge mistake. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of doors slamming shut. I could hear John moving around, stomping between his bedroom and the living room, then to the front door, opening and closing each one, turning lights on and off, and muttering angrily under his breath. Through the frosted window, I could see his shadow pacing frantically, back and forth, again and again. My room was pitch black, so I knew he couldn't see in. All of a sudden, he let out a scream. "I can't deal with this anymore! Why are you doing this to me?" I thought maybe he was on the phone venting to someone, so I stayed quiet. But then, he yelled my name, his voice echoing through the house. I realized then he was yelling at me. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I tried to move as quietly as possible, slipping out of bed, heart racing, as I started shoving clothes into a backpack. I was almost finished when he shouted again, "I can hear you." The next second, he was right outside my door, pounding the wall so hard I thought he might break through it. But he didn't touch the door. Frozen in place, I glanced at the window. His shadow moved closer, and I could see him leaning forward, pressing his ear right against the glass. I sat there, barely breathing, terrified that even the slightest sound would set him off. He shouted my name one more time and then stepped away from the window. I heard him begin his pattern of pacing around the house again. My shoes were outside my room, sitting on a small rack near the door, so I knew getting out quickly wouldn't be easy. I'd have to step out, grab them, put them on, and make a run for it. I thought I'd wait until he went back to his room, then dash out and grab them as fast as I could. But as I was planning this, he suddenly stopped pacing. "Do you want to fight about this?" he shouted. "Come out right now and we'll settle this. I swear, I'm not playing around." I froze. I'm a small woman, barely over 5 feet tall, and this guy was easily 3 times my size. No way was I going out there to confront him. After what felt like forever, he turned off every light in the house. I heard his door open, then shut softly. The whole place went completely silent. I took a deep breath, hoping I was safe, and quickly opened my door. I snatched up my shoes, but when I looked up, he was already standing in the dark hallway, just a few feet away. He was wearing nothing but boxers and socks, staring at me with this eerie calmness. "Ma'am, we need to talk," he said softly, almost like he was trying not to scare me. I didn't even think. I grabbed my shoes and sprinted straight out the front door, not even bothering to put them on. I ran barefoot down the street, only stopping once I'd made it half a block. I glanced back, and there he was, standing in the glow of our porch light, just watching me. He didn't move, didn't call after me. He just stood there, watching as I ran away. Luckily, a friend lived a couple blocks down, and I had their spare key on me. I let myself in and crashed on their couch. I ended up staying there for the rest of the week while we sorted things out with our landlord. John agreed to move out by the end of the week. He said he couldn't remember anything from that night and didn't know if it was all real or not. But he said if I claimed it happened, then he believed me. The day he left, he texted me a photo of the house keys sitting on the kitchen table, along with a simple message: "I'm gone." I took a friend with me to check it out, just to be sure. When we got there, we found out that not only did he leave a bunch of his food and stuff behind, but he'd also ripped all the fire alarms out of the ceilings. He even unscrewed the deadbolt from the front door and laid it out neatly on the hallway table. What really freaked me out was my bedroom door. It could only be locked with a key from the outside, and it was locked when we got there. That meant he'd still had a key to my room. We called a locksmith right away to change every lock in the house. Even after the locks were changed, I couldn't bring myself to stay there alone. Every night I'd barricade my door with chairs and other heavy furniture just to feel a little safer. To this day, I still wonder what could have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. It's clear he had some serious mental health issues, and I do worry about his safety sometimes. But I also think about how lucky I was to get out unharmed. I was browsing through the local classifieds, trying to find a cheap computer for my younger brother. He needed one for school, and I didn't have a lot of extra cash to spend. I figured I'd give him my own laptop, which was a decent Lenovo model, and pick up a cheaper one for myself. As I scrolled through pages of overpriced machines, something unusual popped up. A brand new looking laptop priced at just $50. Immediately, I reached for my phone to dial the number, but a bunch of warning bells went off in my head. Why was it so cheap? The post said it was a Lenovo, but the picture clearly showed a Dell. And why did the ad suggest meeting up late at night? The address given seemed to be on the outskirts of a small town, almost in the middle of nowhere. Ignoring these red flags, I called the number anyway. I didn't want to miss out on what seemed like a steal. A guy answered, his voice sounding like he had been dragging on cigarettes since birth, raspy and unsettling. He introduced himself as Mike. I told him I wanted to meet somewhere public, like a diner, no later than 7:30 p.m. He hesitated, suggesting an empty parking lot in an area I didn't recognize, but eventually agreed to my terms. Thursday came, and I pulled up to the diner around 7:25 p.m. I looked around, half expecting to see no one. But there he was, Mike, standing outside. He seemed to be in his mid-50s, maybe older. As I rolled down my window, the stink of stale beer, sweat, and something else I couldn't quite place hit me like a wall. I stepped out, noticing right away that he wasn't carrying anything. Something inside me screamed to get back in the car and leave. As soon as I realized what was happening, I yanked myself back into the driver's seat, my heart pounding like crazy. Mike must have picked up on my panic because he made a sudden move, diving for the open door. Thankfully, I managed to slam it shut just in time. But then, my stomach dropped. I'd left the window wide open. Before I could react, his hands were already reaching through, fingers clawing at the air, almost brushing against my shirt. I threw the car in reverse, tires screeching against the pavement. Mike stumbled back, losing his balance, and I hit the gas, speeding away, heart racing. But unfortunately, that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept waking up at odd hours, convinced I saw a dark shape drifting past my bedroom window. The lack of sleep was killing me, and my grades were taking a nosedive. I finally called up my buddy, Rob, and asked if he'd crash at my place for a few nights. He brought his German Shepherd, a big, intimidating dog that would hopefully keep me from losing my mind. It was around midnight when the dog started growling, low and menacing, at the front door. Rob and I jolted awake, the dog snarling, filling the room with tension. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the door, nearly tripping over the dog. I held my breath and turned the knob slowly, and when I peered through the peephole, I felt like I was going to throw up. There, standing just a few feet away, was Mike. Rob didn't hesitate. He flung the door open, and the dog lunged forward, snapping and barking like crazy. Mike staggered back, hands up, and I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911. The cops arrived fast and dragged him away in cuffs. I told them everything: the Craigslist ad, the meetup, his name, and even his scratchy voice. They said they'd let me know if anything else came up. For a while, things quieted down. But months later, on a random Tuesday morning in September of 2017, I got a call from the precinct. The officer on the line told me they'd done some digging and discovered that Mike had been stalking me ever since that night in the parking lot. It didn't make any sense. How had he followed me home when I'd left him lying on the ground? Then they told me the most disturbing part. While lurking outside my house, he'd taken photos of me. Dozens of them. All snapped through my window, capturing me asleep, unaware. The flash must have been what woke me up those nights, and the shadow I saw, that was him slipping away. It's been nearly 2 years since that call, and I still haven't gone near Craigslist or anything like it. I couldn't even bring myself to give my brother my old laptop. Instead, I worked overtime to save up and buy him a brand new one. I just can't shake the fear that someone else could be out there, lurking in the dark, waiting for me to slip up. Please, if you're reading this, be careful out there. We have no idea who's really behind those too-good-to-be-true deals. Stay safe and trust your instincts. It might just save your life. Back when I was gearing up to start college, my parents insisted that I live on my own and pay my own way through it. So, a few months before the semester began, I landed a job. I wasn't earning much, just enough to scrape by, but I guess that was their intention. They wanted me to figure it out myself. I was determined, though, and did whatever I had to keep things afloat. One bad decision during that time was turning to Craigslist for a place to rent. There were no dorms because the college was too small, and living at home wasn't an option due to the long commute. I had to move out anyway, since the cost of gas alone would have killed me. I found a small place not too far away, and thankfully I already owned a beat-up car that could get me back and forth. The place was run by an older guy who came off as nice enough at first. He didn't say or do anything strange, just showed me the house, handed me a contract to sign, and explained how much rent I'd need to pay each month. The agreement also mentioned that he'd only fix things once a year. I was young and eager, so I signed without a second thought. Nowadays, I'd be a lot more cautious about a condition like that. But back then, I didn't know better. With the living situation sorted, I focused on my job to save up as much as possible before classes started. I thought I was getting settled in when my landlord began texting me out of the blue. At first, I saw it as a friendly gesture, like he was just being nice or making sure everything was okay. He never came off as creepy, so I figured staying on good terms with him would make things easier down the line. But the conversations slowly shifted, and I wasn't sure where to draw the line. One night, after a long shift at work, I was beyond exhausted when I got home. Just as I collapsed onto the couch, my phone buzzed. It was him again. He sent me a lengthy message about how his wife was driving him nuts. He claimed she was making his life miserable over something trivial. I felt a bit sorry for him and replied back, trying to be supportive. Then, out of nowhere, he sent me an even longer rant, making her out to be some sort of monster. He kept messaging me about it. I tried to be polite and go along with the conversation, but I never really knew what to say. He thanked me for being a good friend, but I didn't consider us friends. I was just trying to keep things civil between us. A few days after that, he hit me up again. This time, he told me he'd gotten into another huge fight with his wife. His texts were full of self-pity, saying he was stuck in his car because she'd kicked him out. He threw around phrases like, "I'm at rock bottom," or "I've got nowhere else to go." I had a sinking feeling that he was trying to tug at my sympathy strings, playing the victim card way too hard. Something about his story didn't sit right with me. I felt like he was leaving out a lot of details and twisting the situation to make himself look good. I also had this gut feeling that he was building up to a big question, something that would put me in a really awkward spot. And I was right. My mistake was not cutting him off sooner. I kept replying because I didn't want to risk making him mad or having him spam me endlessly until I answered. It took a little bit, but eventually, he asked if he could crash at the place just for a few days while he sorted things out with his wife. I was freaked out. Being a woman half his age, it felt super inappropriate. I didn't think he realized, or maybe he didn't care, how it might look. He kept begging, saying it was only temporary and promising not to bother me. Against my better judgment, I finally gave in and said he could sleep on the couch. But the whole thing felt wrong. He subtly hinted at how he'd cut me some slack on rent before, and I didn't want to rock the boat. I told myself it would only be for a couple of days. What could go wrong? The next thing I knew, we were dragging his stuff from the car into the house. Looking back, it totally looked like he was moving in. Before I knew it, I had a sort of roommate situation. At first it wasn't too bad, but then he started acting like he owned the place, which, I guess, he technically did. He'd nitpick about the way I did the dishes or where I left my shoes. And then he started calling me these weird pet names. I told him straight up that it made me uncomfortable, but he just brushed it off and kept doing it anyway. After a while, I realized he wasn't planning on leaving. A few weeks turned into a full month, and it was obvious he'd given up on whatever issues he had with his wife and was now focused on me. Every day, it got worse. He started wandering around the house in just his underwear, ignoring my complaints and dismissing my discomfort. I kept telling him to put on some clothes, but he'd just laugh it off or act like I was overreacting. Things took a darker turn one evening when he got bold and began flirting with me, making inappropriate comments. When I told him to cut it out, he smirked and said, "You know I could kick you out any time, right?" That shut me up fast. From then on, I avoided him as much as I could. College was starting in a few weeks, and I shouldn't have been dealing with any of this. Then, about a week before classes began, he got a little more aggressive, shouting, slamming doors, and I realized this situation was dangerous. I had no idea what was true about his marriage, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out. I went back to Craigslist, looking for another rental nearby, though it meant I'd be a bit further from school. I found a listing that looked decent and contacted the landlord right away. He agreed to let me move in on one condition: no pets. I didn't have any pets, so I jumped on it. I packed up quickly and started moving out the next day. When my landlord saw me carrying my stuff to my car, he acted all sad, asking if I wasn't his friend anymore. I didn't want to cause a scene or set him off, so I mumbled something about needing a cheaper place, hoping he'd buy it. No way was I going to admit that I thought he was a total creep, and I was running away from him. If I had, I was sure he'd have lost it, maybe even hurt me. He texted me non-stop after that, begging to know where I'd gone. I'd told him I'd keep in touch, but of course, I blocked his number and ghosted him completely. I lived with this gnawing fear for months, always on edge, convinced I'd bump into him around town. I kept a low profile, barely went out, but slowly, over time, I started to forget about him, and life went on. My new place turned out fine. The landlord was distant, barely responded to requests, but at least he didn't try to be my friend. So, if you ever have a landlord who tries to cross that line into friendship, remember my story and don't let them. Say what I couldn't and make it clear that boundaries matter no matter what. And definitely never, ever let them sleep on your couch. I'm a 42-year-old guy living in North Carolina, in a quiet house just outside of town. My wife passed away 5 years ago from a battle with breast cancer. Since then, I've been on my own, staying out in our old country home, about 5 miles from the nearest store. The place is pretty isolated, but it's not too far if you need something. I get by on a small monthly compensation check after a back injury left me needing a cane to get around. So, I spend my days looking after a small vegetable patch I've grown on our land. It's not just for show either. I've got rows of beans, corn, and pumpkins, everything you'd need to live off the land. If you came by, you'd most likely see me tending the garden or riding around on my tractor. That's where my troubles started. You see, my old tractor wasn't cutting it anymore. The thing's been in the family for over a decade, but the engine's getting tired. So I figured I'd put it up for sale online and use that money to buy a newer one. I thought it was a solid plan. The only thing I needed was someone willing to buy it. I'd used Craigslist before, but never for something this big. Last time, I'd sold a busted-up old motorcycle my brother left me, but that was years ago when I still had the energy to mess around with fixing it up. This time, I wrote up a quick ad that read, "Old John Deere tractor for sale, $1,300, or best offer." Within hours, I was flooded with messages. Most were junk, people offering half the price or asking for installment payments. But there was one guy who seemed serious. The caller sounded young, maybe in his 20s, and said he was getting into farming on some land he'd just bought. He claimed he had the cash on hand and wanted to see it that evening. Seemed a little too perfect, but I agreed to meet him anyway. When the time rolled around, I made myself comfortable on the front porch, waiting. The guy never showed up. Instead, as the sun started to dip behind the trees, I felt a sharp crack on the back of my head. Next thing I know, I'm out cold. When I came to, it was dark, and I was lying on the porch, blood running down my face. My front door was wide open, and the place looked ransacked. I could hear someone inside, yanking out drawers and breaking things. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't get up fast enough to stop him. A man appeared in the doorway. He was younger than I expected, early 20s probably, and he was holding my wife's old music box, a sneer plastered on his face as he pocketed her locket. He glanced at me, then smiled, the kind of grin that tells you this is fun for him. He turned to leave, like he didn't have a care in the world. Pain shot through my leg as I tried to get up, but I couldn't even make it to my feet before he was gone, disappearing into the darkness outside. The pain in my leg was unbearable. It felt like someone had jabbed a knife into my shin and twisted it. "Stay down, old man," he sneered. "Don't make me knock you out again." I couldn't do much but watch as he disappeared into the trees behind the house, taking with him the few things I had left of my wife. My stomach churned, and I cursed myself for being so helpless. I lay there, sprawled on the wooden porch for what felt like forever, maybe half an hour, before I managed to roll onto my side. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to look down. My leg was ballooned up, swollen and angry looking, the skin tight and shiny. Every time I brushed against it, the pain shot through me like electricity. I had to do something. I couldn't just lay here and bleed out. I reached for my pocket, only to find it empty. No phone. He must have taken it when he knocked me out, probably just to make sure I couldn't call anyone. If I didn't get help, I'd be dead by morning. But that's exactly what he wanted, wasn't it? To leave me to suffer until I bled out or got eaten alive by whatever wandered close. The thought of it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't have a landline either. Hadn't had one in years. I didn't see the point, living so far from everyone. It had been ages since I'd seen a neighbor. Hell, I barely went into town more than once a month. A guy like me could disappear, and no one would even notice. Gritting my teeth, I started dragging myself down the porch steps. Each bump of the uneven wood made me wince, but I kept going. I had to. My truck wasn't far, parked just past the garden shed, about 20 yards or so. It felt like miles as I crawled over the dirt, the pebbles and twigs jabbing into my palms and knees. I paused to catch my breath, my leg throbbing with each heartbeat. From this angle, lying half in the dirt, I could see the woods better, and I remembered something. We'd always had wildlife around, but over the past few months, I'd noticed more coyotes. And not just any coyotes. These were bold, unafraid. They'd come right up to the house, sniffing around like they owned the place. I'd shot at them a few times, warning shots mostly. They'd flinch but not run. They'd just stare, like they were sizing me up, daring me to do more. It was like they knew I wouldn't actually kill them, just trying to scare them off. Looking back now, I realized how wrong I'd been to think that way. Breathing hard, I glanced around, half expecting to see one of those coyotes slinking out of the shadows. They'd gotten so used to me that I wouldn't be surprised if one came right up and sniffed at me now. Only this time, I didn't have my rifle. I didn't have anything but a body that could barely move and a leg that felt like it might explode. Those coyotes always looked like skin stretched over bones, all ribs and hunger. I figured it was just bad hunting grounds out here. Barely any deer, and even the rabbits were few and far between. Probably why I never saw them much during the day. They had to be picking through trash, maybe even snatching up the occasional stray cat or farm animal. They seemed desperate, so I didn't think much of it when I saw one a few yards away, right between me and my truck. Normally, I would have just clapped my hands or thrown a rock, anything to send it scampering. But now, on the ground and bleeding out, I wasn't in any position to do much of anything. It stood there, tongue lolling, eyes fixed on me like it was considering its next move. "Get out of here," I croaked, but it didn't flinch, just lowered its head and took a step closer. I had to keep moving. If I didn't reach that truck, there'd be no getting out of this. I inched myself forward, hoping that the sudden movement might spook it off. But the coyote didn't run. Instead, it started circling, sniffing at the air, its eyes darting from my leg to my face and back again. It wasn't afraid of me. That much was clear. It saw a chance. Then it lunged. Teeth sank into my leg like a vice, and the pain that shot through me was worse than anything I'd ever felt. It tore a scream right out of me, and I thought I'd black out right then. But something kept me conscious, a mix of fear and anger that drove me to swing wildly at its head. One of my fists connected, and the coyote yelped, stumbling back before it turned tail and disappeared into the brush. I sucked in a breath, every nerve in my body screaming. I should have felt relief, but I couldn't even let myself relax. Not with what I saw next. 3 more of them, standing just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. That's when I knew I was in deep trouble. They'd been watching the whole time, and now that they'd seen me barely fend off one of their pack, they weren't about to back down. I struggled up, pushing my good leg beneath me. Dragging myself wasn't going to work. If I stayed on the ground, they'd be on me before I made it halfway. I heaved myself up onto one knee, gasping from the effort. The pain in my leg flared up like a hot iron pressing into my flesh, but I forced myself to move. I was half crawling, half hopping, sweat pouring down my face. My body screamed at me to stop, but I kept going, shuffling and clawing my way to the truck. I reached the door handle, fingers shaking as I yanked it open and tumbled inside. My heart was hammering like a drum, but at least I was safe. Safe, for now. But as soon as I slammed the door shut, my vision went fuzzy. It was like someone turned the lights off in my brain, and everything just faded to black.